The wrench hit the concrete floor with a sharp clang that echoed across the Bell Aircraft Corporation factory. March 1942. Captain James Foster stood 20 feet from the P-39 Airacobra, arms crossed, jaw set. "I'm not flying that death trap," he said. His voice carried across the assembly floor where 30 workers had stopped mid-task to watch. This wasn't drama. This was the 5th test pilot refusal that week. The aircraft sat there in the harsh factory lighting, gleaming like a promise. Revolutionary mid-engine design. Tricycle landing gear that made it look like something from the future. A 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, the kind of firepower that could tear a bomber apart. Every line of the fuselage screamed innovation. Bell's engineers had poured everything into this fighter, but nobody wanted to fly it. Not the British, who'd cancelled 675 aircraft from their order. Not the French, whose order became void when Paris fell. And certainly not American pilots who were requesting transfers to any other squadron, any other aircraft, rather than climb into a P-39's cockpit. What made this devastating wasn't just the refusals, it was the timing. America had been at war for 3 months. The Pacific was burning. Europe needed fighters desperately. And here sat a brand new fighter aircraft with a production line ready to roll, and pilots were walking away from it like it carried a plague. But what happened next would turn this rejected aircraft into one of the most lethal fighters of the war. The twist? It required shipping it 6,000 miles away to people who fought an entirely different war. The problem started at 15,000 feet. That's where the Allison V-1710 engine, mounted behind the pilot in that revolutionary mid-engine configuration, began choking for air. American fighter doctrine demanded high-altitude performance. The war in Europe was being fought in the thin air above 20,000 feet where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs prowled. The P-39 could barely breathe up there. Lieutenant Robert M. Peterson filed his report after his 3rd test flight. The language was clinical, but the message was brutal. Aircraft exhibits severe performance degradation above 12,000 feet. Climb rate inadequate for intercept missions. Combat ceiling insufficient for bomber escort duties. He didn't mention that the engine had nearly quit on him at 17,000 feet. That detail spread through pilot ready rooms faster than any official report. But the altitude problem was just the beginning. The mid-engine placement, that innovative feature that made aviation engineers excited, created a weight distribution that made pilots nervous. The engine sat directly behind the pilot, the 37mm cannon and its ammunition directly in front. This put the center of gravity right at the pilot's seat. Perfect for maneuverability in theory. Terrifying in practice. Because when you put a P-39 into certain maneuvers, particularly flat spins, the aircraft had a tendency to tumble. Not spin gracefully like other fighters. Tumble. Like a brick falling off a building, rotating through all 3 axes simultaneously. Recovery was theoretically possible. Theoretically. 3 test pilots had punched out rather than try. 2 more had recovered but filed reports recommending against the aircraft entering service. The British had seen enough. In 1941, they'd placed massive orders, desperate for any fighter that could challenge the Luftwaffe. After testing revealed the altitude problems, they cancelled 675 aircraft. The RAF needed fighters that could climb to 25,000 feet and dance with German fighters in the thin air over the English Channel. The P-39 couldn't do that. So those aircraft sat in crates, unwanted, while the Battle of Britain raged. Alexander Kartveli sat in the Bell Aircraft Conference Room in Buffalo, New York, defending his design to a room full of skeptical military brass. Kartveli was Bell's chief designer, the man who'd conceived the P-39's radical layout. "The design is sound," he insisted, technical drawings spread across the table. The mid-engine configuration provides superior maneuverability at low to medium altitudes. The nose-mounted cannon offers devastating firepower. Colonel Frank O'Driscoll Hunter, chief of fighter operations, wasn't buying it. "Your superior maneuverability killed 2 pilots last month. Your devastating firepower is useless if we can't get the aircraft to combat altitude. British cancelled their orders. French never took delivery. Our own pilots are refusing to fly it. What am I missing here, Mr. Kartveli?" What he was missing was that they were preparing the P-39 for the wrong war. but nobody in that room knew it yet. By April 1942, the P-39 program was on life support. Production had started, but orders were soft. The Army Air Forces was already pivoting toward the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt, fighters that could fight at altitude. There was serious discussion about canceling the P-39 entirely, converting the factory to build something else. Anything else. The aircraft had become a cautionary tale in military procurement, a reminder that innovation without practical application is just expensive experimentation. Then came the telegram from the Soviet Union. The request came through Lend-Lease channels in May 1942. The Soviet Union wanted P-39 Airacobras. Not a small order. They wanted every aircraft the Americans could spare. The reaction at Bell Aircraft and the Army Air Forces was identical. Confusion. Why would the Soviets want a fighter that American and British pilots were refusing to fly? Had they not read the performance reports? Did they not understand the altitude limitations? The confusion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how wars were being fought in different theaters. The Americans and British were fighting in the skies over Western Europe and the Pacific. Theaters where altitude meant survival, where bomber formations cruised at 20,000 feet, and fighter combat happened even higher. They'd designed their doctrine around vertical warfare. The Eastern Front was horizontal warfare. Brutal, low-altitude combat where the highest priority was supporting ground forces locked in the largest land war in human history. Soviet tactical aviation doctrine wasn't built around bomber escort or high-altitude interception. It was built around ground attack, close air support, and low-altitude air superiority. The average combat altitude on the Eastern Front? Between 8,000 and 13,000 feet. Right in the P-39's sweet spot. Soviet test pilots flew the first P-39s delivered through Lend-Lease in July 1942. Their reports read like they were describing a completely different aircraft. Excellent acceleration at low altitude. Superior roll rate. Cannon firepower exceptional for ground targets. Handling characteristics favorable below 4,000 meters. The mid-engine design that made American pilots nervous? Soviet pilots loved it. The forward center of gravity made the aircraft incredibly responsive in low-altitude dogfights, where fights were won in seconds. That 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, the weapon that seemed like overkill for shooting down fighters? Perfect for destroying German tanks, trucks, and locomotives. One hit from that cannon could disable a Panzer III. The altitude problem that plagued the P-39 in American service simply didn't exist in Soviet service. German fighters on the Eastern Front operated at the same low altitudes as Soviet aircraft, dictated by the tactical needs of supporting ground operations. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s that were optimized for high-altitude combat in the West found themselves fighting in the weeds on the Eastern Front, and the P-39 was perfectly designed for that environment. Major Alexander Pokrishkin received his first P-39 in April 1943. He was already an ace, with 9 kills flying inferior Soviet fighters. He climbed into the cockpit of the American fighter with the same skepticism American pilots had shown. 30 minutes later, he landed with a completely different opinion. The aircraft felt like an extension of his body. The visibility was excellent. The car door entry and tricycle landing gear gave him better sightlines than any Soviet fighter. The armament was devastating. Pokrishkin flew the P-39 for the rest of the war. He would become the second highest scoring Allied ace, with 59 confirmed kills. 53 of them were scored flying the P-39. When asked why he preferred the American fighter over newer Soviet designs, his answer was simple. It does exactly what I tell it to do, exactly when I tell it to do it. In combat, that's the only thing that matters. He wasn't alone. Grigory Rechkalov, another Soviet ace, scored 56 of his 56 kills in a P-39. Nikolai Gulayev, 55 kills, all in P-39s. The pattern repeated across Soviet fighter regiments. The aircraft that American pilots called a death trap became the mount of choice for the deadliest pilots on the Eastern Front. The Soviets modified the aircraft to suit their needs. They often removed the wing-mounted machine guns to save weight, relying entirely on the devastating nose-mounted 37mm cannon and two 50-caliber machine guns. They developed tactics specifically for the P-39's strengths, high-speed slashing attacks from low altitude, using the superior roll rate to evade counterattacks, leveraging the cannon against ground targets when aerial targets weren't available. The statistics tell a story that contradicted everything American evaluators had predicted. Between 1942 and 1944, the United States delivered 4,746 P-39s to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. The Soviets were so satisfied with the aircraft's performance that they requested, and received, an additional 4,719 P-63 King Cobras, an upgraded version of the P-39. Combined, over 9,500 Airacobras and King Cobras served on the Eastern Front. Soviet pilots flying P-39s claimed more than 2,400 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. That number doesn't include ground targets, the tanks, vehicles, trains, and installations destroyed by that 37mm cannon. The P-39 became one of the most successful Lend-Lease programs of the entire war. Not because the aircraft was perfect, but because it was perfectly matched to its mission. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 showcased the P-39's capabilities. The largest tank battle in history required constant air support. Soviet P-39 units flew dozens of sorties per day, attacking German armor columns, providing cover for Soviet ground attack aircraft, and engaging Luftwaffe fighters at low altitude. The 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, flying P-39s, claimed 37 German aircraft destroyed during the two-week battle while losing only 9 of their own. What made the P-39 so effective wasn't just its firepower or low-altitude performance. It was reliability. Soviet pilots flew the aircraft in conditions that would have grounded other fighters: mud airfields, extreme cold, minimal maintenance facilities. The Allison engine, which had struggled in the thin air at high altitude, ran flawlessly in the dense air near ground level. The tricycle landing gear, which American pilots found unusual, proved perfect for rough Soviet airfields where tail-dragging fighters nosed over regularly. Pokrishkin developed tactics that became doctrine across Soviet fighter aviation. The Pokrishkin method emphasized aggressive offensive action, using the P-39's superior low-altitude speed and devastating firepower to dictate the terms of engagement. His most famous quote, "Altitude, speed, maneuver, fire," became the foundation of Soviet fighter tactics. The P-39 was the tool that made that doctrine possible. By 1944, German pilots on the Eastern Front had learned to respect the P-39. Luftwaffe after-action reports noted the aircraft's aggressiveness and firepower. The Russian Airacobras are particularly dangerous below 4,000 meters, one report noted. They exploit their high roll rate and acceleration to engage at close range, where their cannon is devastating. This was the same aircraft that British and American pilots had rejected as unsuitable for combat. The irony wasn't lost on American military observers. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, stationed as a liaison to Soviet forces, filed reports back to Washington describing the P-39's success. His assessment was blunt. The Russians are achieving with the P-39 what we said was impossible. The difference isn't the aircraft, it's how they're using it. Back at Bell Aircraft, Alexander Kartveli followed the reports from the Eastern Front with a mix of vindication and frustration. His design had been correct. The mid-engine layout, the 37mm cannon, the handling characteristics, everything worked exactly as intended. But it worked for a mission profile that didn't exist in American or British service. He'd designed a low-altitude ground attack fighter in an era when everyone wanted high-altitude interceptors. The lesson went deeper than just aircraft design. It revealed a fundamental truth about military equipment. Context is everything. A weapon system isn't good or bad in isolation. It's effective or ineffective based on how it's employed, against what targets, in what conditions. The P-39 failed in one context and dominated in another, not because the aircraft changed, but because the mission changed. By the end of World War II, 9,584 P-39 Airacobras had been built. Of those, over half served with Soviet forces. The aircraft that American test pilots refused to fly became the most numerous American fighter in Soviet service. The Death Trap helped produce some of the highest-scoring aces of the war. The failed fighter participated in nearly every major campaign on the Eastern Front from Stalingrad to Berlin. American P-39 squadrons did serve in limited numbers, primarily in the Pacific Theater where combat altitudes were often lower than in Europe. But they were quickly replaced by P-38s and P-47s. The P-39's legacy in American service was as a footnote, a reminder of what happens when design doesn't match doctrine. In Soviet service, it became legendary. After the war, Alexander Pokrishkin was asked about his aircraft preference. By 1945, he'd flown nearly every fighter the Allies produced: British Hurricanes and Spitfires, American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, and the latest Soviet designs. His answer never changed: "Give me a P-39 and I'll fight anyone." Coming from a pilot with 59 kills and 3 Hero of the Soviet Union medals, that endorsement meant something. The story of the P-39 Airacobra isn't really about an aircraft. It's about the danger of assumptions. American and British evaluators assumed that because the P-39 couldn't perform in their theaters, it couldn't perform anywhere. They assumed that their tactical requirements were universal requirements. They assumed that test pilot reports from Western contexts would apply to Eastern contexts. Every assumption was wrong. The Soviets didn't have better pilots or better tactics. They just had different requirements. They needed a fighter that could dominate at 10,000 feet, not 25,000 feet. They needed firepower that could kill tanks, not just fighters. They needed an aircraft that could operate from primitive airfields in extreme conditions. The P-39 met those requirements perfectly, because those were the requirements it had been designed to meet, even if nobody in Buffalo, New York had realized it at the time. For Alexander Kartveli, the vindication came too late to affect the aircraft's American reputation, but just in time to validate his career. His mid-engine design philosophy would influence post-war fighter development. The lessons learned from the P-39's development and deployment would shape the next generation of American tactical aircraft. But the immediate lesson was simpler. Sometimes the right tool is already in your hand. You just need to find the right job. March 1942, a test pilot refused to fly the P-39, calling it a death trap. March 1943, Soviet pilot Alexander Pokrishkin was scoring his 20th kill in a P-39 over the Kuban. March 1944, the P-39 was the backbone of Soviet fighter aviation on the Eastern Front. March 1945, it had helped defeat the Luftwaffe in the largest theater of the war. Same aircraft, different war, different outcome. The P-39 didn't fail. It just needed to find where it belonged.